It's hard to deal with grief at any age. We're not trained for it, there's no formula for it, and most of us get by as best as we can. For me, that meant doing the only thing I knew how, pushing everything down inside, and hoping I would never have to deal with the feelings of loss and sadness that had so inconveniently arrived on my doorstep. But like anything else in life, the more you push against something, the more tension you create. And eventually that tension has to find a way out. So fast forward a couple of years, and I found myself studying at university. The first year flew by, and it was hard to imagine what more life had to offer. But then that tension, those feelings that had been ignored time and time again, started to find their way to the surface. At first, it was just uncomfortable, but before long, it felt as though they were touching every single aspect of my life. Meeting with my head of year to give him the news that I'd decided to leave and become a monk had been the very least of my worries. I'd been brought up as a Christian, but by the time I reached my teens, I felt no real connection with any particular religion. I'd read a few books over the years, though, and a good friend of mine often used to speak about the philosophy and psychology of Buddhism. I guess it appealed in so much as it didn't really feel like a religion. And the stories of the meditation and the monks and nuns who'd somehow mastered the mind sounded very attractive, not so much as a way of life, but in terms of the result. When people ask me how I became a monk, the question is usually phrased something like, "So what? You just walk up the hill, knock on the door, and ask to become a monk, do you?" And as ridiculous as that might sound, that's exactly what you do. But before you enthusiastically pack your bags, I should add that there's a little more to it than that, including a number of years of training as a layperson, followed by full-time training as a novice monk, and then, with your teacher's permission, you can become a fully ordained monk or nun. In my impatience to find the right teacher, I moved often at first, from one monastery to the next, and from one country to the next. During that time I lived in India, Nepal, Thailand, Burma, Russia, Poland, Australia and Scotland, travelling across many other countries in the process, learning new techniques, and each time building on the foundations of what I'd already learnt, and doing my best to integrate them into my life. With the exception of the walled fortress from which I was about to jump, I found everywhere I lived welcoming, friendly, and thoroughly conducive to the training. And yes, thankfully, I eventually found the right teacher, or group of teachers, as it turned out to be. Living as a monk can be tricky. Not everyone gets the whole bald-headed man in a skirt thing, and trying to demystify meditation for a secular audience while dressed as a monk, which is how I worked, can send out a very mixed message. It's one thing if you're living in a monastic community or retreat, where people around you understand the simplicity of a monk's robes. But when you're living in a city, it's a little different. The more I spoke to people about the benefits of meditation, the more I found that many desperately wanted to find a way to relax, but were uncomfortable with the religious element that robes automatically imply. They simply wanted to find a way to cope with life, to deal with stress, in their work, their personal life, and in their own minds. They wanted to regain that sense of openness they remembered from childhood, that sense of appreciation in actually being alive. They weren't looking for spiritual enlightenment, nor were they needing therapy. They just wanted to know how to switch off when they got home from work, how to fall asleep at night, how to improve their relationships, how to feel less anxious, sad, or angry. People wanted to know how to control their cravings, to give up their addictions, to get a bit more perspective on life. But most of all, they wanted to know how to deal with that nagging feeling that all was not quite as it should be, or could be, that feeling that there must be more to life than this. The integration of meditation into everyday life was key to my decision to stop being a monk and to live instead as a layperson. I became quite shy as a monk. Part of that was down to the introverted way of living, but an equally important factor was seeing more clearly the conditions of my own mind, which left me feeling a little exposed, a little naked, and this was something I was pretty keen to address. I was also keen to address the fact that I'd become very inactive, Prior to my monastic training, I'd been incredibly physical, and yet it was though that had been put on hold for the best part of 10 years. Talking to a friend one day, she mentioned that an old classmate of hers was training at the Moscow State Circus. As she knew I was a keen juggler and had done lots of gymnastics in the past, she thought this might be something worth checking out. Before long, I was having private lessons and loving every bit of it. It was during one of these lessons that my teacher asked me if I knew anything about the degree in circus arts that was available in London. Yes, you heard that right. A university degree in circus arts. Seriously, you couldn't make it up. So I began some tentative inquiries and, sure enough, it really did exist. The demand for places on the course is surprisingly high, but let's be honest. Who'd want to study atomic physics when you can swing around like a monkey on a trapeze all day long? So on paper my chances didn't look good. But late one evening I received an email to say that I'd been offered a conditional place. The condition being that I agreed to sign a disclaimer that, in no uncertain terms, said I was old, more likely to injure myself, and needed to take full responsibility for this fact. Old at 32, who'd have thought it? While the transition from monk to clown may not sound like the most obvious one, there are perhaps more similarities than first meet the eye. The application of moment-to-moment awareness in physical activity was to prove invaluable, in more ways than I could ever have imagined. Think of a circus act, whether it's juggling, tightrope, acrobatics or trapeze. All of them require the perfect balance of concentration and relaxation. Try too hard and you make a mistake. Don't try hard enough and you fall off or slip over. One of the most challenging aspects of training at the circus was constantly being asked to step out of our comfort zones. For most of us on a daily basis. The ego takes quite a battering in that process, and we were encouraged to take ourselves a little less seriously throughout. Funnily enough, this is very similar to the training in the monastery, where the ego is also being challenged. In clowning workshops, still difficult to say with a straight face, we were encouraged to make fools of ourselves, to take risks, to try things out, confident in our ability to fail. We would be sent up onto the stage with no material whatsoever and be instructed what to do. And in those moments, there was nothing but silence, nowhere to run. If we took too long to think about it, the teacher would simply bang a drum to indicate we were finished and send us off the stage. There was no room to escape in thought or reply in clever witticisms. It required a presence, a brutal honesty, to put something out there and see what happens. Sometimes it was inspired and the thrill was exhilarating. Other times it was painful and the result was humiliating. But somehow it didn't matter. What mattered was going out there and doing it, not thinking about it, not worrying what others might think, not even being attached to a particular result, but just doing it. Often in life we get so caught up in the analysis, the dissection of every possible outcome, that we miss an opportunity altogether. Of course, some things require careful consideration, but the more we live mindfully, in the moment, the more we start to get a sense of what feels right. Whether you think of it as a gut feeling, intuition, being guided, or just knowing for yourself that it's the right thing to do, this can be an incredibly liberating discovery.